Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Doug Miller. I'm the director of William Penn's home, Pennsbury Manor. We're in Lower Bucks County here in Pennsylvania. And I want to thank everyone for carving out a little bit of time over their lunch hour to join us today. Today, we're going to be discussing William Penn, the founding of Pennsylvania, and his home. So, a little bit of background on our friend William Penn. He was the son of an admiral in the Royal Navy who also bears his name, Admiral Sir William Penn. I want to skip back just a touch further in his family lineage to his grandfather, Giles Penn, who in the early 1600s was a merchant and was going back and forth to North Africa. And Giles Penn actually helps rescue or negotiate the safe release of 200 English prisoners who were captured by Barbary pirates. For that service to the crown, he was awarded a diplomatic posting to Morocco. And I just bring that up because it starts the Penn family interacting with the crown. Now, Giles didn't have a whole lot of money to come and go on because he was not an overly successful merchant. So what do you do with your kid if you can't provide well for him? You place him in the military. So Giles's son, the would-be Admiral Penn, joins the Royal Navy. He distinguishes himself in battle off the coast of Ireland as a captain of a ship and becomes a rising star in the Royal Navy. He actually meets his future wife, who is a Dutch expatriate, Margaret, and in 1644, they have their first son, who is our William Penn. Now, one of the neat things about being in the Royal Navy at that time for Admiral Penn was if you take a prize, capture enemy shipping, the crew gets a third, the crown gets a third, and the captain gets a third. So Admiral Penn was able to build up quite a war chest, and he was able to send his son to the best of schools. He sends him off to Chigwell, which we would think of like elementary school, but it's a very elite school still in existence in England today. And young Penn at age 11 goes through two life-changing events. Our William will come down with smallpox, and it actually starts early pattern baldness in this poor child. You can imagine how cruel elementary school age boys are to each other. But even a more important thing in young William Penn's life was he had his first vision of God while at Chigwell. And young William is a very, very spiritual young man. Well, in the mid part of the 17th century, or the 1600s, a war breaks out in England. It is a civil war between people who want a smaller or a stronger Oliver Cromwell leading the opposition, and King Charles I, whose shtick is, God made me king and you people should do what I tell you to do. During that civil war, Admiral Penn is serving England, but not in battles in England. He is serving on foreign shores. And at a certain point, basically the legislature or parliament cuts off military spending. And Admiral Penn continues the mission out of pocket. He pays for the commissary of the troops and to keep the campaigning going. This is a debt that will be owed to Admiral Penn. Now, shortly after this, Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads succeed in winning the English Civil War. Charles I is beheaded, and a stronger parliament is instilled, and a much stronger rule of Puritan ideas reign over England. When Oliver Cromwell passes away, our young Penn has already gone through a couple extraordinary experiences, thanks a great deal to Admiral Penn's ability to provide for his son. He actually goes off to Cambridge within 6 months because he is perpetually questioning the faculty. Why do you think this? Why do you want to do this? Admiral Penn gets a letter from the faculty saying, your son is a pain in the behind, and we would like you to take him home. Admiral Penn's frustrated. What do I do with this teenager? So he actually ships him off to France. There's a Huguenot academy in Saumur, which is where young William Penn studies. He spends almost 2 years traveling abroad. His time in Saumur may have planted the seeds for young Penn to think about religious toleration. Huguenots are being oppressed in France, and Penn sees their desire for religious toleration and probably latches onto it. He's an extraordinary linguist and student of languages. He is entertained in the court of Louis. He eventually returns home and is studying under Dad to go into the family business, into the Royal Navy. He, at one point, is serving with his father, and in the early 1660s is tasked to go to Ireland, where there is a mutiny involved, and there's actually a battle at a place called Carrickfergus. Our William Penn, the would-be Quaker, enters combat and is a combat veteran. Within a year of this, he becomes reacquainted with a very charismatic Quaker orator that he and his father had been introduced to. A year after that, he makes his life conversion to Quakerism, and it broke his father's heart because Admiral Penn wanted his son to go into the family business. Young William will see the plague that ravages London. He'll see the fire of London. He and his father actually, during the fire, dig a big hole in the backyard and bury all of the wine that Admiral Penn has stockpiled in his house. We know that because Admiral Penn's next door neighbor is a voracious diarist. By the early 1670s, Admiral Penn has passed away. Prior to that, he had a critical role in English history. I do see in the comments the comment about Quakers being against war. Young William was not a Quaker when he went off to war, and it was taking that oath to become a Quaker, well, not an oath, testimony, and deciding that the peace testimony was for him, perhaps being influenced by his time in combat. It really broke his relationship with his father. His father will cane him, throw him out of the house, they'll reconcile, and as Admiral Penn is passing away, they do reconcile one last time. Prior to Admiral Penn's death, Admiral Penn had a critical place in English history because he is one of 11 very prosperous Englishmen who were tasked to go to Brittany. Today, we would know Brittany is part of France, but at that point, it's actually part of England, where the two sons of Charles I, the beheaded king, are in exile, but they're hiding in plain sight. Admiral Penn's fleet carries this entourage over the English Channel, and they entreat the son, the eldest son, Charles II, to return to the throne in what's called a glorious restoration. Young William is on the ship at that time, and it really establishes this close relationship between the Penns and the crown. Admiral Penn will also take the younger brother of the king to war in an Anglo-Dutch war, where Admiral Penn's fleet will win a sweeping victory in a sea battle off the Dutch coast. It's called Leuencroft, but Admiral Penn actually takes 2 steps backwards, points to James, the younger brother of the king, and says, that victory is all about James. James gets to lay claim to the Dutch holdings. New Amsterdam becomes New York because James is the Duke of York, and it extends the whole way from where we know New York to where it bumps into the Calverts of Maryland, who have a colony below Pennsylvania. Well, the admiral has passed. Young William is a Quaker, but he's inherited this tremendous war chest of his father's, and he takes some of it and invests in a Quaker enclave called West Jersey. He doesn't actually come over here, but he's one of 11 proprietary interests there in the 1670s. Within 5 years, he decides he would like to step out on his own and establish his own colony. There is a family-owned colony just to our south. The Calverts, a family, own Maryland, and it was set up as an enclave for Catholicism. So William petitions Charles II and asks, hey, there was this debt from that Civil War time where my father, funded these campaigns. What do you say? And Charles checks with his younger brother, James, because James has sway over the land that Penn is interested in, which is the land west of the Delaware. They come to an agreement with one caveat. James says, I'm probably never going to go there, but I kind of like the idea of this Newcastle place. So give me a 12-mile circumference around Newcastle. If any of you ever noticed that semicircular part in the southeastern corner of the Pennsylvania map, it goes back to James asking for that 12-mile buffer around Newcastle. Well, in March of 1681, they come to agreement. Charles basically asks William, what would you call your colony? And William stands up and proudly says, New Wales. Charles II had an advisor who was Welsh, who really hated the Penn family. And he asks Charles, please don't go with this. Charles goes back to William Penn and says, I'm not hot on a New Wales idea. Can you give me an alternative? And the alternative young William comes up with is Sylvania. Charles's response is, my family and our country, England, owes a debt to your father that we can never fully repay. So we will name the colony Pennsylvania in his honor. Penn writes to a friend the next day in a private letter. And in the letter, he basically says, everyone's going to think it's a vanity on my part. And here we are 300 and some odd years later, and most people think Pennsylvania is named for our Quaker founder. It's actually named for the British war hero, Admiral Sir William Penn. And I always tell people one of the great examples in history of somebody taking his sword and beating it into a plowshare is William Penn taking this military debt and turning it into the Holy Experiment, where a Quaker colony is founded, but it's founded on religious toleration, allowing other people to come in. So we have William establishing his colony. He asks his cousin to be his advance man. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So Penn has to get ready in England. He chooses for his lieutenant governor and his advance man, Captain William Markham. He's a seafaring captain. He is not a Quaker. He's Church of England. But Penn has determined that his colony will be based on religious toleration. His niche market is the religiously disassociated of Europe, the people who, for religious reasons, are not welcome in their country or don't quite fit in their country. Tongue-in-cheek, guys, I always tease people, it's the crackpots of Europe. My ancestors were Swiss Mennonites, so we were high on the crack job scale. Markham comes with letters of introduction to the Europeans who are living in the Delaware drainage, which there will be about 800 to 1,000 here, and to the Native Americans. And it's Captain Markham who first meets with our local Native Americans, the Lenape, and negotiates the purchase of land, which includes Pennsbury Manor, the site of Penn's future home. Markham also goes to Maryland to meet with the Lord Baltimore, the Calvert holding the title for the family, and trying to establish where are the boundaries between Pennsylvania and Maryland. The following year, after getting the charter, William Penn comes here. His first wife is expecting. They have a number of small children at home, so William is flying solo on this trip. He'll be here from 1682 to 1684, establishing his colony, setting up everything from a form of government to laying out roads and a business plan that unfortunately for Penn was not successful. It's based on what's called quit rent. it is oversimplifying it to say that it's taxes. It's a feudal term where you owe homage to the feudal landowner, but you also pay taxes to him. Unfortunately, being a good and trusting Quaker and stepping into this business with lots of resources, Penn didn't set up a good process for collecting his quit rents, and that will come back to bite him later on financially. In 1683, Penn purchases land. It is right where the Delaware River turns, just below Trenton, New Jersey. And the owner, Thomas King, had actually gotten his land grant directly from the Duke of York. He had started to develop the property. He really didn't want to be bought out. As a matter of fact, when he leaves, he locks the barn and takes the key with him and doesn't give it to Penn. But later that year, Penn will start to lay out his property. This is the only property that William Penn designed for himself. Every other home that he was to own was already extant when he got it. So it's his reflection of what a good life would look like. Next slide, please. And we're going to skip that one because it didn't come through. Penn definitely believed that a country life was better, healthier for people. And again, he's very spiritual. So he believed in the country you would see the works of God, but in a city, in an urban environment, it's the works of men. And basically, he felt it's better for contemplation, better for the soul to be living a country life. Next question. There we go. So William Penn will have to return in 1684 to London. His agents tell him that Lord Baltimore is rushing back to England to plead his case to the crown. The Calvert claim goes back to Charles I, the king who was beheaded. And it actually goes up to the 40th parallel as supposed to be the northern edge of Maryland. When William Penn arrives, because Captain Markham did not get along with the Lord Baltimore, William Penn thought, well, I'll just go down and talk to this fella. And William Penn basically tells the Lord Baltimore that the 40th parallel runs right about where modern day Baltimore is. The Calverts had already claimed more land than that, and they did not agree with this. History proves them right. The 40th parallel is more or less where the Pennsylvania Turnpike is. So those two had to go and take their dispute to the crown. Unfortunately for the Lord Baltimore, it was William Penn's daddy who helped put Charles II on the throne, and William Penn was along. So Charles II actually sides with William Penn and gives Penn sway over the lower counties, which today we would know as Delaware. But the line is never truly set. For the next 3 generations, the Penns and the Calverts will fight over that until the king in the mid 1700s is so fed up, he tells both families, listen, I've hired 2 surveyors, one named Mason and one named Dixon, and I'm sending them over there and they're going to shoot a line and you people are going to live with it and stop arguing. And thus we get the Mason-Dixon line. But the borders were far more fluid in Penn's time. Now, if we go back to that business model and you think of where the 40th parallel really is, the land below the 40th parallel takes in all of Philadelphia and much of the developing colony of Pennsylvania. If you want a great tax dodge or a quit rent dodge, you just say to the proprietor, William Penn, I'm not sure whose colony I live in right now, so you guys settle it and then I'll pay my taxes. Penn quickly begins to dig himself a financial hole by investing in the colony without seeing an adequate return. He is buying land from the Native Americans and selling it at a markup. But he's also living an extravagant life. He came out of an aristocratic family. His father had been knighted, and he was living that type of a lifestyle. In 1699, there's growing unrest in Pennsylvania. Penn has returned to England, and he is not able to make it back for 15 years. He will lose his beloved first wife, Gulielma. He will be accused of treason at one point, be jailed under the threat of death, successfully argue himself out of that, be under house arrest, and lose his firstborn and beloved son, Springett, who I think was his hope for taking over Pennsylvania and the Penn family holdings. Shortly thereafter, he will marry for a second time. And this is a wife that we all know. This is Hannah Callowhill, who becomes Hannah Penn. Hannah is his intellectual equal. She's coming from a wealthy family from Bristol. And as this growing unrest in Pennsylvania comes, it's because there's a population explosion. The Port of Philadelphia was easy to get into, and Penn made it easy for common men who could afford his price to own land. They could come here, they could worship as they chose, and in those first 20 years, Pennsylvania becomes the fastest growing of all the colonies. With that population explosion, the population wanted more of a say-so in their governance. So Penn basically, somewhat grudgingly, says, okay, we'll revisit my frame of government. His initial frame of government had the governor or himself coming up with laws, calling legislature together to endorse them, and then feeding them out to the public. When he gets here and insists that frame really works well, everyone says, no, Bill, it didn't. So somewhat grudgingly, he does revisit it, and Hannah is, from some of the correspondence, intellectually involved in that process, along with some of the governance or the governors here. Penn will ultimately come up with what we call the Charter of Privileges. It picks up the nickname the Charter of Liberties. And there are 3 precepts to our current government that spring out of that. This is the first time where the common man has a right to vote, not just the landholder. It is also a place where the rights of jury and trial by jury is codified, and it basically sets that the will of the jury supersedes the will of a judge, precepts in our judicial law. And finally, it codifies that freedom of religion that we all enjoy today. So in some ways, we can trace some of the origins of our constitutional government back to some of Penn's work. This Charter of Liberties was so popular that 50 years after it's installed, a bell was cast to hang in the State House. It has a crack in it, and everyone remembers it for another reason, but the Liberty Bell was actually cast in celebration of Penn's Charter of Liberties, and it picks up its fame with its place in Revolutionary War history. After doing this work, Penn has a credit problem. He has been borrowing money from a subordinate to make ends meet, and he actually ends up rushing back to England. That subordinate dies before the legal process is settled, and he owes money thus to the widow. Ultimately, he will spend time in debtor's prison. He will continue to have financial problems. By 1710, he's in desperate financial straits, and he actually tries to sell Pennsylvania back to the crown. Queen Anne declines. In desperation, he actually drops the purchase price to the original amount of money that his dad had laid out for that campaigning. And Queen Anne accepts. But before anything can happen, Penn is seized by strokes and is disabled. Hannah, who was recently lost her father within 3 weeks of this, and then has her husband be debilitated by strokes, is left to pick up the pieces. And a son from Penn's first marriage contests Hannah's ability to do this. It ties stuff up, and Queen Anne backs out of the deal. So now Hannah is stuck with this colony that's been losing money. She steps forward, works with James Logan, Penn's secretary, who came over with him in 1699, who stays in Pennsylvania as the Penn's agent here. Those two start to unravel the financial mess that is Pennsylvania. And by the time of Penn's death in 1718, it is the colony is at least stable. The one son still contests the will. In the will, he is supposed to get the estates in Ireland. That legal battle will go on for 8 years. And just before Hannah passes away, the one son predeceases her, and the courts award Pennsylvania to Hannah and the 3 sons from Hannah and William's marriage. John, who's named John the American because he was born here in Pennsylvania, and his younger brothers, Richard and Thomas. And they will be the next generation to run Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So Pennsbury Manor today is a Colonial Revival reconstruction. The property fell into disrepair after Penn. There were people who lived here. An overseer and head housekeeper had fallen in love in the Penn's employ. They were married, and the Penns signed their wedding certificate, and their first married home was at Pennsbury as overseers of the plantation. They will eventually build their own home on land near here and move out. There were meetings here with Native Americans in the 1730s, and those list the house as being in disrepair. By the early 20th century, the manor house is gone. A family named the Croziers have torn down whatever was left and built on the foundations. But there was the remains of a kitchen house, which was a kitchen and a brew house. Half of it remained next door. In the early 20th century, there is a land transfer from the Croziers to a quarrying operation. But there was a gentleman's agreement that that quarrying operation was going to donate the core 10 acres where Penn's home had once stood to create a park in his memory. Well, nothing was happening, and the surveyor who surveyed the land transfer actually went to the head of the quarrying concern, the Warner Company, and asked to meet with the Warner Company president. He was not received after waiting a full day, so he went home and he packed his lunch and he went back the next day, and the next day, and the next day, for a full month until he got his audience. Coming out of that, the land deal was set to transfer 10 acres that is now the core of Pennsbury Manor. Next slide, please. So today we have 43 acres. It reflects a portion of the original acreage. In 1700, Penn had about 40 acres of his plantation cleared and under development. 17 acres would be an orchard. We actually maintain period apple trees here, 2 of which are actually descendants of the one that dropped the apple on Sir Isaac Newton. And our landscape is a Colonial Revival reflection of what a landscape architect in the 1930s thought Penn's home might look like. The archaeologist who explored the foundations prior to Reconstruction actually went down to Tidewater, Virginia to visit a fledgling archaeology project there, where they had started to reconstruct a colonial city based in part on archaeology. And Colonial Williamsburg would pollinate the Pennsbury project. This archaeologist brought the idea back, sold it to a U.S. senator in Bristol, Pennsylvania, just downriver from us, and a WPA-era project would reconstruct Penn's manor house, a kitchen house and brew house, period gardens, a barn, and since that time, we've added other buildings such as a joiner's shop and a blacksmith shop. Today we have about 15 buildings. If I count every privy and woodshed, I can push that up to close to 20. Next slide, please. At this point, I know that my friends at the State Library have more to the presentation, and at the end, I'm going to be more than happy to field your questions. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Miller. We have Michael Lear, who is the Rare Collections Librarian at the State Library, and Kathy Hale, who is Supervisor for Public Services. They have both put together a resource list for you with further reading material that we are going to add into the chat. So you'll have a little bit more information and also how to visit Pennsbury. And then after they are done with their portion, we will go to the questions. Did you want to start, Michael?
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So, yeah, as a complement to Doug's presentation, giving the background of William Penn, and we have some of the documentary evidence, primary source material, things published during that time directly from Penn's writings, or he wrote directly. So starting out to show you some rare materials relating to William Penn that we have in the Rare Collections Library here. So we have things like biographies, correspondence, legal documents, Penn's published writings. And I threw in anti-Quaker work because you see those a lot during the period for all the Quaker religion related items promoting Quakerism. You have an equal number of anti-Quaker works. We have histories of Penn and Pennsylvania and maps. So biographies, remained popular, into the 19th century and today. So here's a 19th century biography of Penn, published in Britain and the United States. And they were actually, these biographies of Penn were popular in other nations as well because of his influence on colonizing Pennsylvania and Quaker religion. So here's a French life of William Penn, 1791. You have the German translation of the French biography, Life of William Penn, 1793. And here's a separate Dutch biography of William Penn, The Life of William Penn, published in 1820. And then we also have correspondence. These are some of the jewels of our collection. So we have this letter from William Penn's son after he arrived in Pennsylvania to start to manage some affairs in 1704. So he writes, "I have been at Pennsbury and like it well." And then he goes on to say, if his father gave him a good gardener, he could make it one of the most pleasantest places on earth. And here's a letter from William Penn himself to James Logan from London in 1709. You can see Penn's signature on the right-hand side on the back of this letter. We have this legal document. Doug talked about the problem between the Penns and the Calverts over what was the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, their disagreement. So this is actually an early agreement in 1723 where they attempted to iron out the dispute between Hannah Penn and Charles Calvert, the 5th Baron Baltimore. So of course this agreement didn't quite take because it took until the 1760s for the border to be settled. Then we have published writings. Doug had mentioned the Frame of Government of Pennsylvania. So this was published in 1602, giving religious toleration. And there are 24 articles and 40 laws in this Frame of Government. So this was kind of like the first Pennsylvania Constitution. And then Doug also mentioned the Charter of Privileges. So this would be probably a later printing, much later printing, of course, or codification of the Charter of Privileges. But this is interesting because it's published by Benjamin Franklin in 1741. Other published writings, these were Penn's, these were published in both German and Dutch. This was Penn's enticement for people to come to his new colony. So it's a description, kind of a sales brochure in a way, of describing the colony and how great it was and the conditions there to try to encourage immigration. And this was one in English to the Committee of the Free Society of Traders. Is doing the same thing. This is an earlier, or actually these are earlier, and then this is a little bit later. And then there's actually a Dutch translation of that. Published writings of William Penn. Here's his account of the rise and progress of the people called Quakers. Another thing on Quaker theology, Sandy Foundation Shaken. This is a collection of different works published in London, 1726, after his death. And this is one of Penn's works on primitive Christianity, of his vision of what Christianity should be. And this is the second edition, but the first edition was earlier. So then following the first edition, these dates are a little out of whack because this is the second edition, but following the first edition of Penn's work on primitive Christianity, then this is the anti-Quaker work by Charles Leslie, Primitive Heresy. That was the follow-up to Penn's work. And then we have history. Here's an early history of Pennsylvania, 1698, very early, and then has this nice fold-out map of Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, which was pretty much the only settled area at that point, the Philadelphia area, and West New Jersey. And then this is the overall map that Doug showed earlier. On my screen, it's hidden here by a box, but in the lower right-hand corner is where that proprietary manor of Pennsbury is located on the map, and that's up Morrisville, Bristol area, north of Philadelphia. And then you can see a close-up of the city plan, which was between Delaware River and Schuylkill River, Vine Street, and South Street. And you can see how tiny the city of Philadelphia is. I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor. You can see how tiny the city is. And then, of course, today it encompasses the entire county of Philadelphia County. So this is the Thomas Home map, one of the earliest maps of Pennsylvania. And then this is a map, 1734, that shows that radius of Delaware. In this case, it looks like it places the Maryland line a little bit further north than it is today, not by much. But you have this radius here, and Delaware was determined by bisecting the Delmarva Peninsula, so that became the border between Maryland and Delaware, and then there was a line drawn from Cape Henlopen straight west, and that was the southern border, and then you had that radius for from Newcastle, the main town at that time. And then there's actually, what's very interesting is this circle touches the bisected line, but then there was an area called the wedge, because now this circle goes, and then there's another little line. It comes out to meet the bisected line between of the Delmarva Peninsula, but there was a little no man's land that they couldn't determine who that belonged to until I believe 1918 or so, before they settled that. So that's the area called the wedge in Delaware, if you ever seen that term. That was kind of left out in their geometry of drawing the map. And then I threw this in just because maps are so compelling. Here's a later map, 18th century map of Philadelphia, and showed that it didn't grow a whole lot more by that time. So that's all I have, and so I'll pass it on to Kathy, who has some other resources at large that we have in the library.
So we'll just give a few seconds here for Kathy to get set up.
Okay, hold on.
I do have a question a while. How far west and north did Penn sell land in PA? You're on mute, Doug.
Sorry about that. I didn't want to interrupt Michael. When Penn passes away, Hannah and James Logan want to establish what land does he have title to through the Native Americans. And in a spot just north of Washington's Crossing today, one of the surveys goes up to that point, and then the line descends pretty much straight southwest until it hits the Susquehanna River. So he had purchased that lower land, but he didn't move that far northwest. His heirs will buy, and I'm using that term very loosely, cheat the Delaware out of, or the Lenape Indians out of their homeland here in Pennsylvania, and the infamous walking purchase of 1737. And there's an estimate of as much as 1.25 million acres being in that walking purchase, and that moves from Wrightstown the whole way up to Maw Chunk, which today we would know as Jim Thorpe.
Okay, I just want to briefly go through the guide that Michael Lear and I have put together so that you will be able to go to the Lunch and Learn, and Ellen put a link to the LibGuide into the chat so that you can go right from here. These are just some of the different books and articles, digital resources that Michael and I have put together. So anytime you go to this LibGuide, you can look at different articles. You can read more about Pennsbury Manor. We also have some different digital materials that you can explore and find out about Penn and Pennsbury Manor. If you go down a little bit in the LibGuide, there are different books that you can click on. This will take you out to the cataloging record for what's at the state library or at other libraries. As Michael and our other speaker has talked about, there has been a lot written about Penn, so that you can see it's not only for adults, but there's lots of things for children as well. We've also helped you by putting in some of the subject areas that you can put into your library's catalog or the state library's catalog in order to learn about Penn or Pennsbury or the Society of Friends. So there's lots for you to look at in order to get materials so that you can go to lots of different places to learn about Penn and Pennsbury. So Nicole, I'm going to send it back to you in order to see if there's any other questions while we have our last 10 minutes of our session today.
So there's a bunch of these in the chat, and I'm going to hand that over to Ellen, actually.
Yeah, I'm looking at them in the chat here. So I see one from Michael. How much of a successor was Penn to George Fox?
So Penn was pretty well recognized as Fox's right-hand man. And when Fox was away and he did go out to preach the faith, one of the things that I think the Quaker faith has great pride in is their place in the abolition movement. And in 1671, Fox went on a speaking tour in the new colony. Penn, as a firebrand new Quaker, was covering bases back in England while Fox is here. He's actually in West Jersey, so right across the river from Pennsbury, speaking to Quakers about the ill of slavery. Now, it wasn't immediate abolition that he was proposing. He wanted good Quakers to act as you would with an indentured servant, where you keep somebody in servitude for a set amount of time, but during that time, you provide them with the means to be successful upon their release. And Penn himself was a slaveholder. Some people he treated that way and released onto their own lives. Others died enslaved to Penn. Frustratingly, he didn't leave a written record of why does this guy rate and not the other guy. But Fox very much looked towards Penn as a sort of a protege.
Okay, here's another one. Was Burlington, New Jersey part of William Penn's land, or was it established by a different group of Quakers?
So Burlington is established under the 11 proprietary interests as part of West Jersey. And it is my belief that the location of Pennsbury had relationship to Burlington, because Burlington is just 3 miles downriver from us. By the time Penn gets here, Burlington was well established. It was a market town, but it was also where the yearly meeting of friends in this area was held. So that would be where each individual meeting will send representatives of their meeting to discuss issues of the faith. So when I talk to school kids here, I say that the Delaware River itself is like I-95. It was not a place that separated people. It was a confluence point because so many people were traveling by water. And remember, Penn grew up on ships. His dad was in the Royal Navy. You have a market town. So as a nod to Central PA, I'll say it's your Sheets. I'm down here in Wawa country. And of course, there's a big battle between those two. And you've got your church right there. So the location of Pennsbury, having proximity to Burlington, was important. Burlington is established in the 1670s.
That's so interesting. So another question, did Penn really have a good relationship with Pennsylvania's Native Americans?
You know, it appears so. And like with any historical figure, and Penn in particular, there is so much legend to the stuff, but I'll bring up a couple points. All the land that is Penn acquires, he purchases from the Native Americans. And he made an effort to learn their language. I've read accounts where they said, oh, he was fluent in their language, but I've also seen in account ledgers where he is paying translators. So my guess is he knew to ask, where's the bathroom and can I have another beer, please? But, you know, certainly did not have full fluency in the language. During his first visit here, it's the summer of 1683, and he determines, I want to see this place that I got. So he actually hops in a dugout canoe with 2 Lenape, and they paddle almost the whole way up to Reading, up to Schuylkill. And there's actually a monument along Route 422 back in the bushes that is reputedly the furthest west that William Penn went, and it was exploring with these Native Americans. Well, Penn is selling land at a markup to the Europeans. When he does, those first purchasers, their deed has built into it the ability of the Lenape or the Native Americans to access their property for hunting and fishing and gathering, because there are times of bounty when the Lenape would come together, the shad run up the Delaware being a good example, and they needed access to the river. The first purchase basically was 15 miles of river frontage, and 15 miles through virgin timber and so on is a lot for people on foot. So he needed to make sure these people had access, the Native Americans, to these places to get their food sources, as well as for trade. Well, there's a group called the Society of Free Traders. Michael kindly showed us a letter that Penn had written to them, and it is filled with descriptive materials about Penn's observations of the Native Americans. And shortly thereafter, some of these society members begin to say, well, you know, we're not really thrilled with these caveats in the deeds and so on. And Penn is incredulous and says, these are the deals and so on. And he stands firm by the side of the Lenape, at risk of some of his financial benefit. But it shows that fairly early on, his model has chinks in it or cracks. After Penn's final visit here, or at the end of it, it's 1701, and Penn is preparing to return back to England. And the word spreads in the native community. 200 Native Americans, sachems and their entourages, descend on Pennsbury Manor that fall. And there's a 3-day blowout party that it's recorded as being a powwow. And I always thought that was a more modern term, but that's a term that was used in 1701. But through translators, the local Indians or the local Lenape write a letter to the King of England that still exists about their good friend William Penn. And I always like to juxtapose Penn's intent when he comes in, which is reflective in the letter that he wrote to the Native Americans that's carried by Captain Markham in Markham's first trip here. And then 20 plus years later, when he has to return to England, what the Native Americans are saying about him. I think there's a lot of truth to his desire to have good relations and try to deal fairly with the Native Americans. I actually, with my educator, went out to Oklahoma and met with tribal representatives of both the Delaware Nation and the Delaware Tribe of Indians, both being descendants of the Lenape, but being separate federally recognized tribes. And they still feel that Penn was one of the good guys. So my belief is there's truth to it. Sorry for a long dissertation on that.
No, that's fascinating and so cool that you were able to go out there and meet with them. To change the topic over, a question about Oliver Cromwell.
Yes.
This person says, I've heard of people making fun of him. Is this because he was not really liked?
Frequently, although I would also suggest people have a predisposition to bust on their politicians. I've worked at 2 sites associated with George Washington, and there's a letter from Washington at the end of his second term, and I'm paraphrasing the quote, but it says, "My way back to Mount Vernon will be lit by the number of effigies of me burning alongside the road." And Oliver Cromwell was not a nice guy. He was very staunch. He was very Puritan, wanted a puritanical oversight of England. So things really kind of clamped down. And you get this backlash from the populace who really, that wasn't the deal they thought they were getting. After Cromwell has passed, when Charles II comes, it's a bloodless restoration. It's called the Glorious Restoration. And he is over the top, flamboyant, as a dresser, as, just the antithesis of what Oliver Cromwell was. And I think that a lot of the displeasure with Cromwell was he was so staunch, and it was such a change from the rule of the monarchy, and a change that was felt at the level of individuals in England. Cromwell did some good things for England, not the least of which was a strong parliament. And when the Glorious Restoration happens, they keep the strong parliament, they just reinstall a king.
Wow. Okay, how does the artwork, the Peaceable Kingdom, fit in?
So, great question. The Peaceable Kingdoms that everyone is familiar with they're generally done by Edward Hicks, who was a folk artist. He was a sign painter here in Bucks County. And in the Peaceable Kingdom, you will see the lion laying down with the lamb. Usually the animals are up front, but always in the background, or almost always in the background, is William Penn treating with the Indians. Now, this is a fellow Quaker propagating the legends of Penn. Hicks's cousin will lead a schism in the Quaker faith over slavery. And in the early 19th century, before the Civil War, the Quaker faith is split over the issue of slavery. The Quakers have already said, we're not going to participate anything more to do with slavery, but there were some Quakers that felt it was such an egregious institution that they had to take action. And these would be the Hicksites, cousin to that folk artist who's doing the Peaceable Kingdom stuff. And in ways, it's a propaganda piece as well. they're beautiful. Colonial Williamsburg and the Philadelphia Museum of Art both had an exhibit on Edward Hicks's works. I'd be willing to bet that the State Library probably has some catalogs of those, and they're just, wonderful pieces of artwork. But again, it is one fellow Quaker a generation later, or a couple generations later, sort of propagating both the faith as well as some of those Quaker institutions that were so core here in Bucks County and continue to this day.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Miller. Your expertise on William Penn is great. I personally can't wait to visit Pennsbury Manor. I haven't been there yet. And I was looking at the website. There's a lot of events coming up, like trick-or-treating and the decorations at Christmas time, candlelight tours. So check out the website. It seems like it's a great time to visit with the fall colors and everything coming up.
We would love to have you guys come to visit. I mean, that's our business. Just like at the State Library, having your patrons come, either accessing everything online or coming to see those special collections pieces. And I can look out my window here and see our new team of oxen, Michael and Roger. We have horses, we have sheep, we have period gardens, 43 acres right on the Delaware. It's a beautiful site. So when it fits with everyone's schedules, do check us out and come to see William Penn's home.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day. We will be putting this recording up on our website, and we'll send a copy to you, Mr. Miller.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.